A young woman locked up a restaurant alone. She never made it home. That night, she was beaten, stabbed, and suffocated, and the police called it a robbery. They were wrong. For 15 years, they were wrong. Because the man who killed her, he sat in her family's kitchen the very next morning, crying, playing the part of the grieving fiancé, and he almost got away with all of it. A restaurant, locked from the inside, the safe behind the counter, open and empty, and on the kitchen floor, a young woman, a knife driven through her throat, a trash bag wrapped around her head. Now here's the part that never made sense. There was no forced entry, none. Every door, locked tight. So think about what that means. Whoever did this, she let them in. She knew them. Okay, stay with me. Because the answer was sitting in a police locker. The entire time, for 15 years. Now here's where 1984 works against them. Investigators did everything right at the scene. They lifted 15 fingerprints, ran them against every database they had, and got nothing, not one match. But they found something else, something Terry left them, skin tissue, under her fingernails. She'd fought back so hard, she tore pieces of her attacker away. In a lab today, that's a name within days. But this was 1984. DNA testing didn't exist yet, so that skin couldn't be read, not by anyone, not yet. They did the only thing they could. They preserved it, labeled it, and placed it in an evidence locker, and there it sat. The answer to the whole case, sealed in a drawer, waiting for technology that hadn't been invented. Before we go any further, listen. On this channel, we don't chase famous cases. We cover the ones everyone gave up on, where the proof was in the building the whole time. Subscribe to this channel and hit that bell, because you're about to watch an entire department walk right past the answer for 15 years. And the man they were looking for, he was the last person they ever suspected. The robbery wasn't real, but it worked. That's the part worth sitting with, because whoever staged that scene didn't just fool the family, they steered an entire police department for the next decade. And it started in the very first hour. The first name they pulled was Steve Daly. Daly had worked there as a cook until Terry fired him. And he didn't go quietly. He'd thrown a violent fit in the kitchen, cursed her out in front of the staff. That outburst is what ended his job. But losing the job didn't end his presence. He kept coming back, as a customer, sitting in the dining room, making himself impossible to ignore. Co-workers noticed it. Management noticed it. It made people uneasy. So when detectives brought him in, he looked like exactly what they wanted. A man with a grudge. His alibi for that night? Not strong. But then he agreed to a polygraph, and he passed it. With nothing solid to hold him on, detectives let him walk. One suspect down, theory still alive. Then the case took a turn. And this is where it really goes sideways. 2 weeks after Terry was killed, it seemed to happen again. A nearby Roy Rogers, another woman, an assistant manager, closing alone. A man came out of the bathroom, waited until the staff was gone. She survived, but barely. And the parallels were impossible to miss. A woman, a Roy Rogers, after hours, alone. Then, 1 week later, it happened a third time. About 130 miles away, in Scranton. A lone female employee, a different restaurant. A man waited until she was by herself, demanded money, and when she couldn't open the safe, she didn't survive it. Now Scranton actually had a suspect, a man named Steve Duffy. So Falls Township moved fast. They got Duffy's fingerprints, compared them to their scene, and they didn't match. Here's the truth that took years to confirm. Both of those attacks were completely unrelated to Terry. Different crimes, different men, just a terrible coincidence in timing. But by then, the damage was done. Because 3 women, 3 restaurants, told the police a story. A predator was out there, hunting women who closed up alone. And that idea took root, deep. From that point on, every lead pointed outward, toward strangers, toward drifters, toward someone nobody in town would recognize. They were looking for a phantom, and a phantom is the hardest thing to catch, because he was never really there. Now, somewhere in those early weeks, they did the routine work too. They talked to the people in Terry's life. One of them was her fiancé, a young man named Scott Keefe, just 22 years old. Detectives asked the obvious question, "Where were you that night?" And his answer was clean. He had an early shift the next morning, so he stayed home. He didn't go by. The family backed him completely. To them, he was devoted, a loving, attentive fiancé. So Keefe was cleared, quietly, quickly, routinely. And the investigation moved on. But there was one small thing, a detail that just sat there. Keefe had a habit, even before that night. He drove past the restaurant, regularly, to check on Terry, to make sure she was safe. At the time, it sounded caring. Nobody thought twice about it. Not yet. So step back and look at where they were. A grudge-holding cook, cleared by a polygraph. A serial predator theory, built on coincidence. And every road they were walking led further and further out of town. But the man who drove past her work, just to keep an eye on her, lived closer to Terry than anyone they chased. They'd already talked to him. And then they let him go. A murder doesn't go cold all at once. It fades. The phones stop ringing. The tips dry up. The detectives get pulled to newer cases. And one day, without anyone deciding it, the work just stops. That's what happened here. By the time the leads ran out, the file was enormous. 90 separate pieces of evidence, logged, cataloged, stored, more than 200 witness statements, all of it pointing nowhere. So the box got sealed, and the case got shelved. 1984 turned into 1990. 1990 turned into 1995. The Roy Rogers where Terry worked eventually shut its doors for good. The corner moved on. The town moved on. But one family couldn't. Here's where you learn something about the Brooks family. Not through tears, through facts. Take Betty, Terry's stepmother. Betty never believed the robbery story. Not once. Not really. Something about it never sat right with her. But she never said it publicly. She never brought it to investigators. She just carried the feeling, privately, for years. Now take George, Terry's father. George saw it differently. To him, the police had done their job. The answers simply never came. That was all. So here's what you had. One parent who quietly doubted everything, one who trusted the system. And that difference sat between them, unspoken, for 15 years. And what about Scott Keefe? Life went on for him. After Terry, he married someone else, had a child, then divorced. And eventually, he moved. Back to Falls Township, back to his parents' house, not far from where the Brooks family still lived. The family had almost no contact with him, not after the funeral. He faded out of their daily lives, just a man who'd lost his fiancée, years ago. That's all anyone saw. Then came 1998, and one decision changed everything. Falls Township got a new police chief, a man named Arnold Connelline, and Connelline knew something the 1984 team didn't. The science had changed. DNA testing had leapt forward. Cases once thought hopeless were getting cracked across the country. So Connelline looked at that sealed box, 14 years of stored evidence, and he made the call. Reopen it. But he didn't stop there. He did something no one in that department had done. He took the case outside. He brought it to a room in Philadelphia, to a group called the Vidocq Society, and these weren't ordinary investigators. Retired detectives, forensic psychologists, evidence specialists, people who'd spent whole careers on violent crime and weren't ready to walk away. Here's how they worked. Once a month, they'd meet for lunch, pick a single cold case, and dig into it together, for free. No fee, no headlines, just the puzzle. And by 1998, they had a reputation for seeing what tired local departments missed. So Falls Township laid it all out for them. 14 years of dead ends. A robbery theory that never named a suspect. And in that room sat a forensic psychologist. His name was Richard Walter. Walter listened to the entire thing. Every lead, every wrong turn. And when they finished, he stood up. And he told them, plainly, "You've been investigating the wrong crime. This was never a robbery," Walter said. "Think about how she was killed. A robber wants money and speed. A robber doesn't linger. What happened to Terry wasn't efficient. It wasn't about cash. It was personal. The open safe, the missing money? Walter called it clumsy misdirection. A cover story, not a motive. The real motive, he said, was rage. This was someone who knew her, intimately, a boyfriend, a fiancé, an ex, someone who felt rejected or threatened by her independence. And then he told them where to look. Stop chasing strangers. Go back to the people closest to her. Specifically, anyone she'd pushed away in the weeks before she died. Stop for 1 second. What you just heard is a 15-year theory dying in a single afternoon. If you want to see how one outsider, reading a crime scene from across a table, sent police straight back to the man they'd already cleared, subscribe now, because what they found next wasn't a hunch. It was a DNA match. So let that land. For nearly 15 years, the investigation had chased the wrong man, the wrong motive, the wrong crime entirely. And it took one afternoon to undo it. Now the detectives went back to the start. Old files, old statements. Reading every name in Terry's life again. This time, looking for someone close. And as they dug, a name came to the surface. A name that should have been in the original file, but somehow never was. Every case has a witness who was never asked. For 15 years, this one did too. Her name was Cindy Bradney, and in 1984, nobody ever knocked on her door. Here's why that mattered. Cindy wasn't a stranger to Terry. She was one of her closest friends, a former co-worker from an earlier job, someone Terry actually talked to, about the things she didn't say out loud. And because the first investigation chased strangers, Cindy was never part of it. Her name wasn't in the file. So when detectives finally found her and sat her down, she told them things no one had ever heard. She started with the relationship. In the months before Terry died, it was falling apart. Quietly, but badly. Cindy described a man who was jealous, possessive, and it got worse, she said. After Terry took the job at Roy Rogers, a new role, more hours, more independence, and he didn't like it. Now remember those drives past the restaurant. In 1984, the family saw them one way, a devoted man, checking she was safe. Cindy saw them differently. To her, it was never about safety. It was about control, keeping tabs on her, making sure she wasn't talking to anyone he didn't approve of. The same behavior, a completely different meaning. She said he wouldn't let her stay alone, and that Terry was afraid to tell him one specific thing. And this is the detail that changes everything. The week before she was killed, Terry told Cindy she wanted out. She wanted to call off the wedding. She just didn't know how to tell him. Sit with that timing for a second. Days before her death, Terry had decided to end the engagement, and she was scared of his reaction. Now line that up against the profile. A relationship Terry was trying to leave. A man who felt rejected. Rage instead of robbery. Everything the forensic expert had predicted, Cindy had been carrying for 15 years. It matched, point for point. The theory wasn't a theory anymore. For the first time since 1984, the investigation had a real suspect. Now they just had to find him. And that wasn't simple. By the late 1990s, he'd dropped off the radar. No easy trail, no current address. Then they caught a break. He'd recently been arrested, in another jurisdiction, for driving under the influence, and that arrest did something useful. It put a current address in the system, Warminster, Pennsylvania, living with his brother, a man named Charles. After all those years, they finally knew exactly where he was, but knowing where he lived wasn't enough. They needed his DNA. And they couldn't just ask for it. Tip him off, and he could run, or lawyer up, or worse. So they watched him instead, learned his patterns, his comings and goings, his habits. And one habit stood out. He was a smoker, and he threw his cigarette butts into the trash outside. That was the opening, because a discarded cigarette carries saliva, and saliva carries DNA. October 1998, an officer moved on it. He pulled the cigarette butts from the trash before the garbage was collected. But the team was careful. Remember, he lived with his brother, so they collected Charles's DNA too, separately. Why? To rule him out, to make sure they didn't confuse two men who shared the same house. Then came the test. The DNA from those cigarettes went up against the evidence Terry left behind, the proof she'd held onto as she fought, and the lab returned two results. Charles came back negative. Cleared, not a match. And then there was the other result. Scott Keefe, positive. Think about what that meant. 15 years earlier, Terry fought back. She marked the man who attacked her. And that mark sat in storage, waiting for science to catch up. Now it finally had. The evidence had a name, and the name belonged to the man her own family had once trusted completely. Investigators didn't rush the arrest. They chose the moment. 15 years to the day, almost exactly, after the night Terry was killed. He'd told the same story for 15 years. So when they brought him in, he had no reason to think it would fail him now. February 5th, 1999. 15 years, and one day, since the night Terry was killed. Alfred Scott Keefe walks into the station. He's 37 now. A man who, to the outside world, had simply lost a fiancée long ago and quietly moved on. He sits down with investigators, and he gives them the same account. The one he'd given back in 1984, word for word. He wasn't there. He had nothing to do with it. But this time, the detectives weren't guessing. So they laid it out. They told him about the DNA. They told him what it matched, and they asked him to take a polygraph. He agreed, and he failed it. That's when the room changed. The story he'd rehearsed for 15 years started to crack. Not all at once, in small pieces. He told detectives he didn't mean for it to happen. Then he caught himself. Pulled it back, said he hadn't done it. But the investigators didn't push too hard. They let the silence sit, and the silence did the work. His account kept shifting. A little here, a little there. And then he said something he couldn't undo. She came at me first. Stop on that line, because for 15 years, he had never once been inside that restaurant. Not in any version he told. And now, in 4 words, he'd placed himself at the scene. There was nowhere left to go. So the truth finally came out. He hadn't ended up there by accident. He'd gone to the restaurant on purpose. Late, after everyone else had left. Why? Because Terry had grown distant, and he suspected what she was planning, that she wanted to end the engagement, so he went to confront her. And here's the answer to the question that haunted this case from day one. How did the killer get inside, with every door locked and no forced entry? Simple. She let him in herself, because she knew him. The thing that confused investigators for years, he explained in a single sentence. Inside, they argued, and Terry told him the truth. It was over. She wasn't marrying him. He said he loved her. But he couldn't accept it. He couldn't let her walk away. And the confrontation turned deadly. Then he did something cold, something deliberate. He stayed, and he staged it. He emptied the safe. He opened the drive-thru window, and he left every door locked behind him, so that by morning it would look like a robbery. Exactly what the police believed for 15 years. But the confession wasn't finished. And what he admitted next is the part that's hardest to hear. The morning after, he went to the Brooks family home. He told them he was worried, that he'd come to check on Terry. But it wasn't worry. He admitted that. It was positioning. He went there on purpose, to stand in the middle of the family's grief, to look like the devoted fiancé, above suspicion. And so he was sitting in their kitchen. When George picked up the phone, when a father called the restaurant and learned his daughter had been killed, Keefe watched that happen, knowing exactly what he had done. That single performance is what kept him free for 15 years. After the confession, the law moved quickly. Alfred Scott Keefe was charged. First-degree murder and robbery. The district attorney didn't hold back. He called it one of the most brutal and heinous homicides he had ever seen. And then there was Betty, Terry's stepmother, the one who never believed the robbery story. When the arrest came, she wasn't shocked by who. "I thought he was involved all along," she said. But my husband did not. 15 years of quiet doubt finally answered. And she carried one more detail. About 2 weeks after the funeral, Keefe had made a point of telling the family he had a date. 2 weeks. That's how soon he was moving on. In the year 2000, it ended. Keefe pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and robbery. It spared him a trial. And on June 6th, in Bucks County Court, he was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. He offered a short statement, barely any remorse, and he never explained why. Not why he did it, and not why he let 15 years pass, without ever coming forward. One detective had spent 7 of those years working the cold case after it reopened. He said it plainly. The work had worn him out. But he was glad it was finally done, and for Betty, after all that time, there was something close to peace. She said she was shocked, and then she was relieved. So here's where it lands. The answer was never missing. It wasn't lost. It wasn't gone. It sat in an evidence locker the entire time, for 15 years. The proof didn't need to be found. It needed the right people to read it. A chief who reopened a closed box. A room of experts who asked a new question. A friend who finally got to speak. And a science that took 15 years to arrive. Terry Lynn Brooks kept the proof under her fingernails for 15 years. The least we can do is make sure her name outlives the man who took it. Subscribe now to this channel so the next family, waiting 15 years for an answer, doesn't wait alone. I'll see you on the next one.